Okay, in the last message we were looking at the Eastern version, some of the minor Eastern ones, almost all of the versions except one, the Gothic Bible that we've looked at earlier. All of them except the Gothic Bible have been Eastern versions. That's our only Western one. Tonight we're going to look at another Western one, which we entitled the Old Church Slavonic, is generally what it's called. And then we're going to begin looking at another one as well. Just like it sounds, Old Church Slavonic. From the Slavs, Slav people, Slavonic, Slavic people, the Czechs and Bulgarians and people of that, even the Russians, Slavic people. Okay, let's discuss a little bit of the background of these people. They're in ancient history referred to as the Slavs, S-L-A-V-S, and they occupied what today is the Eastern Bloc. The Eastern Bloc countries in communist Europe, such as Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria. Those were the countries, of course, that the Soviet Union never made an exit from after the Second World War, and that's how they ended up more or less with those countries, at least with communist influence there. The origin of Christianity here, one thing we don't have in helping us determine the origin of the Slavonic church is we don't have our familiar references over there in Acts 2. Where Luke is telling us about all the various peoples that are in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, and there were Cretes and Arabians, and we just about cover all the various nations of that part of the world of that day, and that helps us give us some type of guess as to how Christianity penetrated that region. We don't have anything about the Slavs or the Slavonic people in Acts 2. They're not mentioned there, so probably Christianity would have come from one of the neighboring regions. It could have come up from Syria, over from Asia Minor, maybe across from Georgia. Somehow from the south, it moved its way, Christianity moved its way up into the area of the Slavonic people. That's not too important. What we want to discuss is another one of these important men. We've had various important men like Mesrab earlier. An important individual, this man's name happens to be Rostislav. Rostislav, R-O-S-T-I-S-L-A-V. He's sometimes referred to as the apostle to the Slavs. He's the founder of the Moravian Empire. Rostislav founded the Moravian Empire in the mid-800s. And of course it was founded in this same area, in East Central Europe. Today it's Czechoslovakia. Now the empire here embraced Christianity under the time and during the time of Rostislav, but the church leaders really interfered with the incorporation of the people into Christianity because in the first place they conducted the liturgy in Latin. Of course, Latin had become the important language of Europe by the mid-9th century. And the people could not speak Latin. The only people who could were the trained church leaders. The liturgy was conducted in Latin, and then the sermon, you ask for a good church service, I mean, here's one you'd get nothing out of. And you could even be on something besides biblical lit and still get nothing out of it. The sermon was preached in the Germanic tongue of the Frankish people. Basically because the church leaders didn't know very much Slavonic. So the liturgy is read in Latin. The sermon is preached in the Germanic tongue of the Franks. And so the local Slavonic churchgoers got absolutely nothing out of the service. You couldn't understand the liturgy. You know what I mean by liturgy, all the hand motions and mumbo jumbo, and then you'd preach a little sermon based on some passage somewhere. You preach a little sermon, and you know what your sermon would be? Mumbo jumbo, and they would get nothing. And so they would just come and sit, and That must be pretty frustrating. It doesn't even compare to when I'm on my best night and my most difficult topic and you get at least a little bit out of it. It doesn't even compare what you would get out of a service like that. You would get nothing out of it at all. So, in the year 863, Rostislav, who had founded this empire and was a Christian man himself, asked Emperor Michael III, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Michael III of Constantinople, who was still in Constantinople at this time. He asked the emperor to send priests who could speak in Slavonic to help the people. Cut out this Latin and German business. What we need is someone to speak in Slavic or Slavonic. So in 863 AD, Rostislav asks the Emperor Michael III of Constantinople to send priests who could speak in Slavonic so that the people could benefit from being in church in the morning. And so he responded by sending two brothers. Both of them were Greeks from Thessalonica. And what we need, of course, are some people who can speak Slavonic. And these are two Greek brothers from the city of Thessalonica. One of them went by the name Methodius. He's not as important as the second brother. Methodius, M-E-T-H-O-D-I-U-S, Methodius. And then his brother, Constantinus. Constantinus. Just like Constantinople, if you get spelling it, and you can end it with I-N-U-S. Constantinus. So Methodius and Constantinus, the two brothers, Greek brothers from Thessalonica, that are sent in the emperor's response to the request of Rostislav. And notice the last four letters of the name Rostislav. See, he's a good Slavonic person. He has Slav right in his name, Rostislav. Now, how does that help? First of all, the church in the Slavic territory has priests that conduct the liturgy in an unintelligible language, preaches a sermon in an equally unintelligible language, and now two brothers are sent who are Greeks from Thessalonica. Well, it just so happens that Thessalonica, although it was a Greek city, had a large Slavonic population. Many Slavs had settled near Thessalonica. And so that's why he did pick these two brothers, or otherwise we'd end up with two brothers who would speak Greek, and then the liturgy would be in Latin, and the sermon would be in German, and the Slavonic people would still get nothing out of it. The less so now that we have an extra and added a third language in here in addition to Latin and German, the Germanic tongue of the Frankish people. So, since we've got a large Slavonic population around Thessalonica, these two brothers, Methodius and Constantinus, had grown up around Slavic people and had picked up the language. So it went well. The two brothers came in the year 864. In the year 864, the two brothers come into what is today Czechoslovakia to serve more or less as understandable church leaders for the Slavonic people. The brothers stay there until their death. Whenever they die, their disciples are eventually expelled. And they fled to Bulgaria, and the church goes downhill among the Slavs from that point. So there's something of what we know of the background of the people and a good foundation for their religion. Now let's come to translations in Slavonic. These two brothers, I didn't say much about them then because I have to save this for now. Their chief contribution was the creation of a new alphabet. That's what we're coming across almost invariably, is that the apostle to, quote, end of quote, the apostle to these various peoples in various countries will come not only to be a church leader, but to give the people an alphabet. If they don't have one, if theirs is inadequate, to give them a new one, of course, with the purpose in mind of giving them a Bible in their language. Now, there are two different alphabets in Old Church Slavonic, and there is quite a bit of confusion as to which of these two alphabets they created, Methodius and Constantinus. So I'll mention them, and it's almost impossible today to say which of these two. We know by tradition which one, but tradition almost in this case seems to be wrong. Okay, first of all, the first alphabet is the Glagolitic. The Glagolitic Old Church Slavonic alphabet. Glagolitic. Glagolitic. This is the older of the two alphabets, and it was superseded by the latter one that we'll mention here in just a moment. It was superseded in the 10th century, the 900s AD. Had 36 letters. Glagolitic had 36 letters. And today, if there's any leaning of opinion on one side or the other of the question that would give us above 50%, it seems like scholars would lean in favor of believing that it was the Glagolitic alphabet that was created not by Methodius but by his brother Constantinus, and not the second one that I'm going to mention here in a moment, which for a long time has felt to have been the one created by Constantinus. So it's still hypothetical at this point until more is discovered, but we will go with that. If there's any leaning, maybe it's 53-47, something like that, in favor of Glagolitic as being the original alphabet. We know it's the older of the two, but the original alphabet that was created by Constantinus. Then the second alphabet goes by the name of Cyrillic. 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 And here's the origin for this name. Shortly before the death of Constantinus, he entered into a monastery, and many times what would happen, there are a lot of old people in church history that have more than one name, and sometimes where they got their second name is whenever they entered the monastery and took their monastic ascetic vows, they also took a new name. They also changed names. And this is exactly what happened to Constantinus. Whenever he took his ascetic monastic vows and entered the monastery just prior to his death, he changed his name to Cyril, Cyril. Hence the name Cyrillic for this alphabet. Because in later centuries, this alphabet was felt to have been the one created by Constantinus. It also has 36 letters, just like the Glagolitic. But it may well be that this was a mistake in ancient history that's been perpetuated by some people down to modern times. And that mistake is attributing the Cyrillic alphabet to Constantinus rather than the Glagolitic. So we're going to go with the Glagolitic, although I don't think it makes that much difference one way or the other. The oldest manuscripts are in Glagolitic. It's the older of the two alphabets. And since it seems like one of the chief purposes for these two brothers, Methodius and Constantinus, in going to the Slavic people in Czechoslovakia was not only to serve as appropriate priests or church leaders for them that could speak in their tongue, but that also Rostislav would have in the back of his mind, he would be familiar with the Bible, a Bible in Latin obviously, that they would also come and give us an alphabet and give us a Bible from the alphabet. So since we know that Glagolitic is the older, and the manuscripts that are extant are oldest in Glagolitic and not in Cyrillic, then it seems since that must have been the first alphabet of the Slavonic people, then probably it was the work of not Methodius so much, but his brother Constantinus. So we will go with that as Glagolitic and not Cyrillic. Now both of these alphabets have just evolved into many different Slavonic tongues in the communist bloc countries today. Russian, Ukrainian, Serbian, Bulgarian, Czechoslovakian, Yugoslavian, you see even Slav there. All of these countries speak languages that originate with the old Slavic people, from Russian to Serbian to Yugoslavian. Now, of course, the language today is not exactly like it was then, not like the spoken Slavonic language back then, but it's very, very similar to that. The manuscripts that are extant are legion. We don't have any problem with extant manuscripts, but many of them are in the form of lectionaries. I've said that the oldest ones are in the Glagolitic script. The later ones are generally in the Cyrillic script, so there must have been an overcoming of the former by the latter. The earliest ones go back to the 10th century, which, as I've said before, also seems to be the date for the origin of the Glagolitic script or alphabet. The oldest ones go back to the 10th century. Now, rather than, let's go on. As far as abbreviations are concerned, for your CA, we really don't have any because it's not an important language. The origins, what was the language from which the Slavonic Bible was taken? No one knows. Probably it was Latin, though, since Latin was so prominent by this time in Christian history. For a date, I've just given that to you, late 10th century. That's the earliest date for the earliest extant manuscripts. Somewhere in the latter part of the 10th century also, the creation of the Glagolitic script. Rather than bring manuscripts, I brought a old church Slavonic Bible. I have some of these Bibles in different languages at home. I haven't always brought the Bibles, but this one's just so interesting I couldn't resist bringing this along. It's really for your curio cabinet, since none of us read Old Church Slavonic, but you can take a look at it as it goes around. That is also supposed to be in a newer script today, what you'll see in the Bible as it goes around. But it'll be very similar to both of the old alphabets, both the Glagolitic and the Cyrillic. Okay, that's all we're going to have to say about Old Church Slavonics. You can tell I'm not too interested in it, that's why I'm passing by it quickly. Now, we're going to get into another area and another language group tonight, and this will be interesting, at least I'm interested in it, because it's much more important than Old Church Slavonic, and that will be, and this gives us now our next to last, besides English. We'll get to English, and that's where we'll spend most of our time. Our next to last one, and that's the Latin language. This is where we'll spend most of our time. Syriac, remember how important Syriac was? We stayed with that for a long time. We'll stay with Latin for, 8 or 10 messages, something like that, and then we'll be with English most of the time. Now we're going to divide the Latin up into Old Latin translations and the Vulgate. Those will be our two divisions. Old Latin translations will probably take us about 3 messages, I would say, something like that, 3 or 4 messages for the Old Latin Bibles. Entirely different, and we have a big cleavage come whenever Jerome comes on the scene. What I want to begin doing tonight is just introduce the Latin language to you before we get into Old Latin translations. We'll probably be able to do a little bit of that this evening, but just to give you some statements to whet your appetite for how important the Latin language is for Bible translations. There's no other early language that can even come close to the Latin language, rivaling it for its place of importance in Bible translations. We're not counting Greek, we're talking about Bible translations. That was the original language. There's no other language even comes close to it. The most important Bible that's ever been written, is the Latin Vulgate. Second, we might put the KJV because it's been around so long. The KJV's only been around almost 4 centuries. The Vulgate held a place of dominance for over 1,000 years in church history. There's never been a translation more important than the Vulgate. We'll get to that later. We're not going to be on that right now. We are, by the way, to Western translations again. Gothic and Slavonic are the only 2 Western translations we've talked about prior to this time. All of the others are Eastern Bibles, Eastern versions that are generally not thought to be as important unless they're early, like one of our Syriac Bibles. But the old Vulgate, the greatest of the Latin versions, it's the only great production in the area of Bible translations that Western Christendom had to offer for almost 1,500 years. I'm going to read a couple of quotes here from an author, from Metzger, and his views, his praise for the Latin versions. He starts off by saying, it would be difficult to overestimate the importance of the influence exerted by the Latin versions of the Bible, and particularly by Jerome's Latin Vulgate. I mean, the Latin Vulgate in one sense holds the sway in Roman Catholicism even down to today. So we're talking about 1,600 years now, 1,600 years. Now, they have other Bibles, but their other Bibles are based on the Latin Bible. Yeah. Whether one considers the Vulgate from a purely secular point of view, with its pervasive influence upon the development of Latin into one of the Romance languages, or whether one has in view only the specifically religious influence, the extent of penetration into all areas of Western culture is well nigh beyond calculation. Listen to that again. The extent of penetration into all areas of Western culture, the Latin Vulgate, is well nigh beyond calculation. The theology and the devotional language typical of the RCs, the Roman Catholics, were either created or transmitted by the Vulgate. Both Protestants and Roman Catholics are heirs of terminology that Jerome either coined anew or rebaptized with fresh significance. Where do you think we get words like this? Salvation, regeneration, justification, sanctification, propitiation, reconciliation, inspiration, scripture, sacrament, and many others. Every one of those terms has come from the Latin Vulgate. And now they're just common terms even in Protestant theology. Salvation, that comes from a Latin term, not from a Greek term. Jerome is the one who gives us that term. Regeneration, justification, sanctification, propitiation, reconciliation, inspiration, scripture, the sacraments, all of that has come through the Latin language, from the Latin language to us. Then he goes on commenting about other things. That's a good place to begin, to let you know we're not talking about anything small here. Never has the Bible been written, and I think we would be well within the bounds to say never will a Bible be written that will come close to having the influence of the Latin Vulgate. The KJV is a distant second. It's only been around 375 years now. It is a distant second. Wow. Where the Vulgate is still being translated, still being published 1,600 years later. And it's not just its lifespan, that's one thing, but you can even have a bad thing that lives a long time. Its influence, so look at these terms here, that we Protestants, too many of Protestants today, they don't realize that we are indebted to the Latin Vulgate. And when you think Latin Vulgate, you think of Catholicism, although that you really shouldn't, because it wasn't that then, it is now. But they don't think Latin Vulgate when they think of salvation or regeneration or justification, all of these heavyweight theological terms. Now, and by the way, most of these terms are not very good terms, and that's because they come from the Latin and not from the Greek, and they give us a different idea than the Greek gives us. So it's not that I'm praising these terms, I'm just showing you the influence that's been exerted by the Latin Vulgate. A term like sanctification, we've talked about that before. We talked about sanctify and sanctity and saints and holiness. Sanctification is a terrible term. I pray God that He will sanctify you wholly. Sanctify, what does it mean? These are beautiful terms. We think of them now as being beautiful terms, but you have to define all of these terms. Inspiration comes right from the Latin, not from the Greek at all. The Greek has an entirely different word, an entirely different concept than what we pick up in our mind with the term inspiration. Propitiation. Another good Latin term, but not a very good biblical term, though. Regenerations is a better term. Justification's an okay term. Some of these are okay. Sacrament, that's not too good of a term. Scripture, well, Scripture's okay, but what is a scripture? We're so familiar with the term, we know what it is now. Some of those are very bad terms, like propitiation, inspiration, and probably chief among them, sanctification. So I don't mean that that the terms are great. It's just that they have so filled not only RC theology but Protestant theology as well. So we're going to come to the Vulgate, and most of this is due to the Vulgate, by the way. I said we're going to look at two different divisions here: the Old Latin translations, and then the New Latin translation, which of Jerome's day was the Vulgate. these terms and the influence does not come through the Old Latin translations, but all of that originates with Jerome's Vulgate. The Vulgate was like the Peshitta. The Vulgate was an attempted standardization. Now, if we have an attempted standardization, that means we have a lot of other versions that come before it. The Peshitta was the attempted Syriac standardization. And we have old Syriac Gospels and Tatian's Diatessaron that come earlier. What do we have earlier than the Vulgate? Well, just for lack of a better term, we probably should sum them all up as the Old Latin translations. There's much debate over whether there was one, several, or many, but I'm totally convinced that there was a plurality of Old Latin translations. No single work, and certainly not done by a solitary individual. How many Old Latin translations? No one really knows. Because of the fact that Jerome's Vulgate comes on the scene, interrupts the progression of the Old Latin versions, and then grows to such an extent of popularity that it pushes the Old Latin versions right out of the scene of history. That's probably why we don't know as much as we would like to know about the Old Latin translations. If the Vulgate never would have come along, then those would have carried on a little further. They carry on for a long time, which shows their popularity. The Vulgate doesn't really become what we think of as the Vulgate. I'm getting ahead of the story now, but really up into the 6th century. It's same business with the LXX, and if I have to say this again whenever we get to the Vulgate, we will. Whenever lay people read a book and they see something about the Septuagint, that 70 Jewish scholars translated the Old Testament, they think of a book with a binding and a front and a back, and they did it all, and you have all of the books there. We know the LXX took at least 100, maybe 150 years to get the whole thing translated, and then we don't have until maybe 400 or 500 years later the Apocrypha put into the LXX, so now we have an enlarged LXX with the Old Testament canonical books from Hebrew into Greek, and with the Apocryphal books in Greek as well. Same is true with the Vulgate. And people think, they have the misconception, if they know anything about the Vulgate in Jerome, that Jerome sat in his little cave in Bethlehem and wrote the Vulgate, and that's a whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation. No, there's a lot of debate on exactly how much did he translate, how much, especially of the New. The old is much better in the Vulgate than the New. The New is not worth hardly anything at all. The Old Testament's a better translation. That's where Jerome majored. That's where he spent his time. But what I was going to say is, it doesn't really gain the ascendancy until up in the 8th and 9th centuries. So that just proves the popularity of the Old Latin versions, that they continue to be copied and copied and recopied and used by the people for 500 years and more so. They don't really stop until up in the 12th and 13th century. And we're almost 1,000 years after the end date for Jerome doing his Vulgate, which was around 405. He died in 420, and he completed his work in around 405. But anyway, we'll get to the Vulgate later, and I'm sure I'll have to repeat all of that again. One thing that is interesting, in light of the fact that in Roman Catholic Church history, such great reverence is attached to ancient important works and deeds and thoughts and peoples and items and icons that you have. It's interesting that not a single reference or legend has come down to us giving us some specific, definite information about the Old Latin translations. And as one author has pointed out, that's probably something to be thought of as interesting, because the Catholics are notorious for trying to trace everything they do or say or have back as far as possible. They want to trace it back as far as possible, and they have all the legends and the lores preserved about various peoples and deeds. And they do not have a single thing preserved about the Old Latin translations. So we're not indebted to R.C. historians in theology to know much about Old Latin translations, because they would be just as much in the dark as would be Protestant church historians or theologians. Let's begin this evening looking at the roots of the Old Latin translations. Plural. If I say singular sometime, Old Latin Bible, I mean a plurality of them. How many we don't know, done by whom we don't know, when it was done, well, we'll be getting to that here in a few moments. That brings us to the subject of looking at the origin, the roots for the Old Latin translations. Now, where I want to begin here is in asking ourselves the question, where was the Bible work done? Old Latin, you see, many people in many countries spoke Latin. If it was a Syriac Bible, it was done somewhere in Syria. If it was an Ethiopic Bible, it was done somewhere in Ethiopia. If it's a Latin Bible, then there are many guesses as to the origin for the place of the Old Latin Bible. Well, Rome would obviously probably be the first guess, and at the first glance, the most reasonable guess. There was a church in Rome by AD 50. Paul was writing to the church in Rome by AD 50. So Christians were there. Talking about Bible translations. The Bible was written in Greek, translated when, by whom, where into Latin. That's what we're looking at now. A church was there. A church was there, you see, long before it was up among the Slavonic people, the Slavs. So what about Rome? Well, I'm going to give you some evidence against Rome, although that's probably the first guess, and at first glance the most reasonable guess, as being the place of origin for the Old Latin Bible. First of all, the people spoke Greek in Rome. It was bilingual, obviously. They spoke Latin as well. But the people spoke Greek, they spoke Latin, and most of their writing was done in Greek rather than Latin. That tells us something right away. Yes, there was a church in Rome in AD 50. Yes, it was a church to which Paul was writing. But Paul wrote the epistle to the Romans in Greek and not in Latin. They must could read Greek in Rome then. They must not have had a need for a Latin translation, since they were a Greek-speaking and especially a Greek writing and reading population. So here are some statistics against the notion, and it's a good notion at first glance, but against the notion that Rome would be the place of origin. First of all, I just gave you one. Paul wrote Romans in Greek. Why didn't he write in Latin? He wrote it to the capital city of the Roman Empire, of the Latin Empire, but he wrote it in Greek. Secondly, another point of evidence, Juvenal was angry over Rome being turned into a Greek city. And he writes this around AD 100. The Roman Latin writer Juvenal. These are just little small tidbits, traces of evidence for the popularity of Greek in Rome in the first century and not Latin. Thirdly, the vast majority of Jewish inscriptions which have been discovered are in Greek. Now you're familiar with the end of Paul's journey, the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 28. He ends up in Rome, and as soon as he gets there, a Jewish delegation meets him, and he wants to know whether or not they have heard some of the charges laid against him. We've gone through that with the Agrippas and Felix and Festus, and he ends up finally over there in Rome. And the Jewish delegation says, no, we've not heard anything either by letter. There's no delegation has been sent out from Jerusalem or from Judea here to Rome to warn us about you. It's been several years. Paul had to stay at Caesarea, remember, for 2 years. And then it takes them all winter long just to get up here to Rome. Remember, they have the shipwreck on Malta, and they stay there, Malta or Melita. It goes by two different names. They stay there the winter months, which would have been 3 months. They stay there, and then they finally make it up into Rome. And Jews meet him, and they haven't heard anything about this case against Paul. Probably the Jews back in Palestine know that the statute of limitations has run out. It's been 2 years now. They really couldn't press their charges against him. But what the Jews do say is, we do know about this sect of Christianity. And what we've heard about, it's not been very good. Well, my point is, a whole Jewish delegation met him, and then after that we read in the last 20 verses, the last 12 verses of the chapter, of the book of Acts, chapter 28, then Paul says, we'll meet again. And they do meet again a few days later, and he has this consultation with them, and they reject the word, and he quotes Isaiah and said, well did Isaiah prophesy of you. And that scripture is quoted many times in the New Testament whenever the Jews reject the message. So there was a Jewish population there. It'd be easy to have many Jewish inscriptions around. They're not in Hebrew, they're not in Latin. Most of the Jewish inscriptions found to this day in the city of Rome are in Greek. The fourth place, other early leaders. Other early leaders in the church wrote either to or from Rome in Greek. This goes on for quite some period of time. Paul is the earliest of them, but it takes place for a long time. Clement is a good example. He writes in Greek and not in Latin. Ignatius, some of these write to Rome, some of these write from Rome. Hermas, Hermas, writes in Greek. Justin Martyr writes in Greek. And Hippolytus, Hippolytus. Hippolytus writes in Greek. And then fifthly, the names of the earliest Roman bishops. In the majority are non-Latin names. So those are small points of evidence, but they add up when you start enumerating almost a half a dozen points of evidence against the popularity of Latin, particularly as a written and read language in Rome in the first century. As a matter of fact, that will hold for a little while longer. Greek actually held sway until the start of the 3rd century. It really held sway until the start of the 3rd century, particularly as the written language. Now, I don't mean by that there were not compositions done in Latin, both written and read. I'm just saying that Greek held sway. The majority of works were in Greek and not in Latin, up until the 3rd century. It's not until AD 200 where we have our first use of Latin in Rome in a theological context, treatise, beginning of the 3rd century. It's not until AD 200 that we have our first use of Latin in Rome in a theological treatise. So, a Latin version in Rome. I mean, just look at the evidence and see what we're trying to prove here. We're asking ourselves, what was the place of origin for the old Latin translations? Did they even have a need for a Latin Bible in Rome? Evidently not, since everyone spoke Greek, and particularly whenever you wrote or read, it was in Greek. Was there a need for a Latin Bible in Rome in AD 50? Evidently not. In AD 150, evidently not, although we're getting close to the time where probably a change was taking place in switching and swapping from Greek to Latin. I would say probably we couldn't have a Latin version even possible here until at least, let's give ourselves the years AD 175 to 225. That's very late. Syriac Bible's already on the scene, long been on the scene. Tatian's Diatessaron is already on the scene by this time. We've got several Syriac Bibles on the scene. But, of course, Latin and Greek weren't holding sway over in that part of Syria that day. So the old Latin translations would really have to come, whenever they are coming, if they're ever coming in Rome, would really have to come quite a bit later than the old Syriac Gospels. Now, that's not necessarily true of another location. I'm just saying that's true of Rome. Now, you might not have known that about Greek and Latin in Rome. I guess we would just all think, well, Rome, that's Latin territory, Latin Empire, the Latin capital of the Latin Empire. But Greek held dominance for the first 3 centuries. So we're going to give ourselves the date AD 175 to AD 225 as a possible date for the need of a Latin Bible in the city of Rome. That's remarkable in itself, that they would not have had need of a Latin Bible for that many centuries. So that guess as a place of origin is not the best. Then another guess, we're still looking at the roots, the place of origin for the old Latin Bible. Another guess is Syrian Antioch. Syrian Antioch. Now this didn't really come into vogue until the end of the 1800s as a possible solution to the question of the place of origin for the Old Latin Bible. It was suggested in such things as Hastings' Dictionary of the Bible that Syrian Antioch was the place where the Old Latin Bible was first done. Now, and by the way, a lot of times, especially in these older works, the scholars are implying whenever they say that this city is the best place for the Old Latin Bible, that there was one Old Latin Bible, one Old Latin translation done by an individual. And that just does not seem to be true at all. I think we'll give you enough evidence to prove that just cannot be true at all. We have many Old Latin Bibles, versions, translations done by evidently many different people. Now the reason this guess was made, and it's not a valid guess, and it's not really a valid reason, that's why it's not a valid guess, is because of what some people have felt to be old Syriac traces in the Old Latin manuscripts. Now even if that's true, that still doesn't place the Old Latin Bible necessarily in Antioch, because the old Syriac Gospels, the old Syriac translations were very, very important translations. And they could have been picked up in any part of the Eastern Empire and incorporated parts of it, traces. At least you could see the influence of the old Syriac Gospels in Old Latin Bibles. So that's not a very good guess as a place of origin. Before I go on, do you have a guess where it's going to be our next one, as a matter of fact? After all the information that we've already given you about the Roman Empire and where things are taking place and what's going on where. It's not in Rome, it's not in Palestine, it's not in Syria. We've covered almost all the countries of Europe. It's not in Great Britain, it's not in South America, Antarctica, Australia, Africa, Central America, USA. Where was the Old Latin Bible done? Where I heard Alexandria? Spain. Now Spain was occupied by Latin people at this time. Paul's wanting to get over to Spain, remember. Sicily, you're getting closer. Sicily's getting closer. Greece, you're headed further. Sicily, what's just south of Sicily? Carthage, where is Carthage? North Africa. Remember, North Africa is a very strong Latin territory there. And what's interesting about North Africa, as I've said before, is it's just so buffered and separated from everyone and everything else. Down here, here's Sicily. And this is where all the population is. Someone's guessing Spain. We're way over here into France and Spain. And they certainly are populated by this time. Greece and Asia Minor, and here's Syria. Way up here, all of our other translations. Here's Egypt. And what goes on over here? Well, not a lot of anything. It's a lot of sand, a lot of desert over here. But we know the ancient city of Carthage here that was destroyed by the Romans. It was a Phoenician colony. It was repopulated by the Romans. It's, again, an important city by this time, by the 1st century A.D. And there are many important cities that exist along the shore here. North Africa, and I'll give you evidence for this as well, not just a guess, North Africa seems to be the best solution for the origin of the Old Latin Bible. And probably one of the chief reasons is this. The Greek language is the important language of the empire. It's been important now for several centuries. The Greek language occupies everything. It's taken over everything up here. But of course, one place that Alexander the Great never made it to was North Africa. He got down here into Egypt, Alexandria. That's a Greek city as well. They speak Greek in Egypt. They speak Greek in Alexandria. North Africa was isolated, insulated from the effects of the Greek language because it was insulated, protected from the conquests of Alexander the Great. So since we've got Greek everywhere else, now we've got Latin in certain portions of the empire, but if you've got Greek and Latin together, Greek is always going to win out because Greek is the older language. But when you get down here and you've got Latin, these are Roman people that have colonized this whole territory. They've come across either from Rome or from Rome to Sicily over here. When you've got Latins that populate this territory who don't speak Greek, and they do speak Latin, they're going to have a Bible as well. And so probably here's where we should look for the origin of the Old Latin Bible. After the end of the Punic Wars, whenever Carthage was finally razed to the ground, remember, The soldiers actually remained. Many of the soldiers remained and began repopulating the territory. We're talking about 2nd century BC there. Obviously, they spoke Latin. They were from Rome. They spoke Latin. Over the next couple of centuries, colonists from Rome traveled to North Africa because it was a good environment. It was a good place to settle down. And as I've said, Greek never really touched the area. In this little story that I'm going to give you next, we probably have at least a germ of our most important, quote, proof, unquote, of North Africa as a place of origin for the Old Latin Bible. So get down as much of this as you can. It's just one little historical story from church history. In the year AD 180, persecution broke out in a place called Numidia. Numidia, which is modern Tunisia today. We have a record of the trials of the Christians in a certain city in Numidia. The city's name was Silium, Scillium. And this record happens to be the most ancient document in African church history, not counting Egypt now, North Africa and the rest of Africa. The most ancient document in African church history is this one little record of persecution, local persecution, in Silium in Numidia in AD 180. Now, what we have in this record is a list of the names of the Christians who are to be executed for their faith. By the way, the means of execution was decapitation, and that's also mentioned in this document. And the document is in Latin, and the names of all of the Christians are Latin names. Now that's AD 180. That means Greek has not penetrated there, AD 180. Or their names would be in Greek. They'd have Greek names. They have Latin names. And here's the rest of the story. The proconsul asked one man, one of these Christians who had come to have his head cut off for his faith. This man, as he was walking up, had a little, well, it was called a capsa. That might even be on your list of terms. A capsa was like a little box or a little cylinder that you kept scrolls in. You kept biblical scrolls in. This one man who was going to be executed was, as he was going to be executed, the proconsul asked him, "What do you have in your capsa? What do you have there?" And he replied, and then this has been written down and it's in this document, he replied, "Books and letters of a just man, comma, one Paul." So he must have had some of the Pauline epistles with him. Since he is a man born locally in North Africa, he must not have Greek copies of Paul's letters. He couldn't read them then. How does he know what he has? Books and letters of a just man, one Paul. It's very unlikely that he could read Greek. They must have been in Latin. So our conclusion is the Pauline epistles must have been available by AD 180. In Latin, this would be part of the Old Latin group of translations then. Now, if the Pauline epistles, and you see this is just about the beginning date for even a possible Latin translation up in Rome. We said anywhere from AD 175 to 225 would even be possible to have a Latin Bible up in Rome. That was done locally anyway, because they wouldn't have a need for it. They're speaking Greek there. But down here in North Africa, Well, of course, we have a different situation on our hands with Greek not penetrating and Latin being the local common language, whether spoken, read, or written. Then what we definitely have need of is the Latin Bible if Christianity has reached here at all. Christianity has either come from Rome, that's a good possibility, or it's come westwardly from the Christians in Alexandria and Egypt. If we have Pauline epistles in AD 180, what else do we have at this time? Probably the Gospels. Why is that? Gospels would come first to tell the life story of Jesus Christ, and then the documents of Christian doctrine would come after that. That must mean the Gospels have come earlier. Now, we couldn't set a date, but let's just say 160 the Gospels must have come. Of course, you could go back to 60, and you would probably be well within your right to do that. 60 A.D. But just move ourselves 20 years earlier. But here's another thing to think of. We just have a local commoner. He's not anyone important. He's just a local commoner who's going to be executed because of his faith in Christ. A local commoner has a capsa that has letters, books and letters of the Apostle Paul. That's rather remarkable unless there were a lot of them available for a lot of the people there. Now, if there are a lot of them available, that means we have to give ourselves more time. Then for me, that would move ourselves at least, way back into the beginning of the 2nd century A.D. We don't know much about the origin of Christianity here. It's just hypothesized. We don't have good records of who came when or where. But it's just hypothesized. They either came from Rome to the south or from Alexandria to the west. And it would have to be one of those two suggestions for the origin of Christianity. It probably would have come relatively early as well. Well, you could even move yourself back into the 1st century, but we don't have manuscripts that attest to that. So I'm going to say at least back into the early part of the 2nd century A.D. would be the beginning date for the Old Latin translations. Where were they done? They were done initially in North Africa. Now they're going to be done later in other places as Greek passes off the scene and Latin appears on the scene. This is such an insulated, protected group of people here. Their manuscripts aren't going all over the world, not until a later period in time in church history when we get great people like Augustine, the famous Bishop of Hippo down here. He's in North Africa. Then his writings go everywhere. But until then, Latin stays down here, Greek passes off up here, Latin becomes dominant up here, therefore we have a new need for new Old Latin translations in other parts of the Mediterranean world. Here's some other proofs for the fact that the Old Latin Bible is existing back this early. Tertullian, he's writing around AD 200, shows clear traces in his quotations of an existing Latin Bible. And of course the Vulgate doesn't come on the scene for 200 more years. So he's not quoting from the Vulgate. Tertullian's also from North Africa. Cyprian, 25 years later, AD 225, shows clear traces in his biblical quotations that they come from an existing Latin Bible. And Augustine, he's kind of late, AD 400, so he's not as good of a proof as would be Tertullian and Cyprian. But Augustine, famous Bishop of Hippo, and we'll discuss Augustine more later. He and Jerome have some run-ins, of course, over Jerome's Bible. Jerome kind of likes it, and Augustine doesn't like it. And they send a letter back and forth, one or two back and forth between themselves, arguing over the validity of Jerome's Bible. But Jerome's the ancient old man scholar, and Augustine's just the young kid fresh out of school, still green behind the ears at this time, and so Augustine does finally fall on his knees before the great biblical scholar Jerome. So 3 men. Now this is in addition just to this local record that we have of the persecution in Numidia in AD 180. Now later on in church history, Christianity vanishes from this part of the empire. The region of Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Algeria. After the Vandal raids in the 5th century and the Muslim conquests of the 7th century. But these churches, these early Latin churches in North Africa, were some of the brightest lights in early Christianity because they were just not affected by other things in the empire. And proof of the fact that they are some of the brightest lights of early Christianity, you look at the names of some of the people I've just given you that are writing from here. Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine. Augustine has to be one of the greatest names in church history. He's writing from this area. So that is one of many things to prove that we have bright lights shining for Christianity in North Africa. But I said that's until the Vandal raids of the 5th century and the Muslim conquest of the 7th century. So, North Africa then definitely seems to be the best guess for the earliest Latin translations of the New Testament. Date would be somewhere probably early, maybe if you want to be just hyper-conservative, you could say early to mid 2nd century, which puts it very, very close to the old Syriac Gospels. But Syria is closer to Palestine than is North Africa, so it only makes sense that we'd have earlier translations up in Syria than down and over in North Africa.